again, and welcome back to Mimsy Park and to episode 3 of this Disney live-action remake series that we are on this journey of. I've got to come up with a shorter name. This is getting a little bit ridiculous. But in the meantime, while I do figure out a shorter name, probably won't, we find ourselves at 2017's Beauty and the Beast. And I gotta say, just to set the premise of this whole episode, I did not hate this movie. Of the 3 we've gone through so far, Cinderella, Jungle Book, and now Beauty and the Beast, it's definitely the truest to the original movie, and it added new stuff that made me not as angry as the previous 2 have. I mean, even really from the very beginning of the movie, it's made very clear how true to the original movie they're going to stay in this, because we do get the Disney logo, and then we get, you know, the shooting star going over the castle, but the castle in the very opening is the Beast Castle. And after we get that logo and a shot of the castle, we zoom out a little bit, and it was really cool the way they did it, because basically the intro with the Disney logo just blends seamlessly into the opening shot, which is basically a zoom out of the establishing shot, and then we see the old hag's hand grab the rose, pick the rose, and then we get a zoom in on the palace. I went into this movie very, very skeptical, because Beauty and the Beast is always in my top 3 to 5 on Disney classics that are my favorites. Top 3 to 5 are always fluctuating. Peter Pan's always at the top. The top 3 to 5 always fluctuate, but Beauty and the Beast is always at least in the top 5. So I went into this one expecting a lot. I didn't go into Cinderella expecting a lot. I went into the Jungle Book expecting a lot and was sorely disappointed. So I went into this one super skeptical and was actually pleasantly surprised. And not even just with that opening shot, but with the next scene after that establishing shot, we go into the prince, and they did a very good job of showing the vanity of the prince. Because in the original one, we get kind of like a stained glass kind of thing going on with it, where they kind of narrate us through it and everything. In this one, they really actually acted out, and it was a really good example of adding something to the story that doesn't take away from the original and actually adds relevant information without going over the top. I will say that the music number that they do had me a little worried, but it's added, but it's not super long, even though this movie does clock in at over 2 hours, because they just can't find it in themselves to stick to the I understand the remakes, but when you're adding so much extra crap that it's over 2 hours is too long. It's too long, especially for these movies. If you're trying to make kids movies, which I'm still not sure they're making kids movies, I'm still under the impression that they're making action movies. This one, not so much, but we'll get around to that. The opening scene, he's having this ball, he's having this dance at the palace, and even just, they do the makeup a little over the top to kind of underscore the vanity. Even the way he goes into the crowd, though, he's looking at all the dancers, and he's looking at all the people as if they're objects. He's objectifying everybody at this party. And then, of course, we get the scene where the old hag comes in. She offers him the rose twice. He laughs at her. She reveals who she truly is, and the curse takes place. And this is where we get a really good glimpse into what the Beast is going to look like as far as quality of CGI, which we'll get around to. But this whole opening scene was very true to the original movie, added a little bit to update it, which, you know, I get that. I know it seems like I'm like totally against them updating these whatsoever, but it's not. It's the fact that you update these so much that they're nothing like the original stories, and then you go, oh, well, they're adaptations of the original story, like the book literature version. And they just do it kind of like to explain why they added stuff here and there. They go back and forth. So again, this is why we'll be reviewing these movies from an old school Disney fanatic standpoint, because that's where these movies come from. That's how I fell in love with them. Even going from that opening scene, when we go into the village where we first see Belle, it is different, but the way they did the village, the designs, the costumes, everything about it feels like what you would expect a live action version of her village to look like. The set design is great, the costumes, everything visually, except the animation here and there, is very well done. In the original movie, she's reading a book. When we first see Belle, that's really the whole point of her making her way through the village, is that she's reading a book, and she's making her way through the village to get to the library, which really isn't a library in this. It's more of a collection of like half a dozen to a dozen books sitting on a table. That's pretty much the library in this one. The librarian isn't a librarian. And I understand they may not have had big libraries back then, just in small villages, but they had more than 12 books. The first actual full song, the one that we know from the original movie, is in this one, and it made me go, hallelujah, they finally used the original soundtrack. And it was very evident they were going to put in new numbers and new music from the very opening scene at the palace, but thank God they did put in a lot of the old music that you're used to. Now, with that said, it lacks a lot of the heart and soul and jazziness that you get in the original one. I don't know if this has to do with them not training voice actors the same or training the vocalists and singers the same, but the old movies there seems to be more oomph in their voices. There seems to be more soul and there seems to be more heart in the songs from the originals. In this, like Emma Watson's voice, I could take it or leave it. It sounds like every generic pop singer, to be completely honest. Like, it just sounds flat. And I don't mean flat in a tonal way, I just mean in a substance kind of way. It just feels flat. And that could just be me being super unbelievably biased and opinionated, but that's just kind of how it felt. Like, the song is there, and it's great that the song is there, and I think that it's a great example of how important the music is to these movies, that just by the songs being in there, it can pull you in so much, especially when you're talking about something that has to do with so much nostalgia, and you've already got people that are super into it. Like, the songs are what we remember from these movies a lot, and so to put them in there and actually have them be a part of this really helps draw you in from the very beginning. And a great example of it kind of lacking the heart and soul is like the I need 6 eggs lady, where she comes on. It's like the funniest part of this whole song is in the original, the lady comes on and she goes, I need 6 eggs, and she's like really stressed out. In this, it's more like she's just going through the market. I need 6 eggs. That's too expensive. It's just like, there was no comedy in it. Honestly, if you weren't paying attention to the song, it would just go right over. Now, once we finally do get to meet Gaston and LeFou, it becomes very apparent that whoever casted them did just an awesome job. Luke Evans and Josh Gad as Gaston and LeFou, respectively, are fantastic together. They have great chemistry. They really bring these characters out. And I will say, of all the characters in this movie, I feel like Gaston is the truest to the original character. I don't know if it's the way he was written, the way Luke Evans portrayed him, but Luke Evans does an amazing job as Gaston. And as far as looking at the characters being as true to the originals as possible, he does the best of anybody in this movie. And I really feel like when we see Gaston and we see LeFou, when it really became apparent how good the costume design was, just because I feel like they got his costume down just to a T. They really did. I mean, they nailed it on that one. And so we skip ahead to where we first meet Maurice, Belle's dad. And I love Kevin Kline. I really, really like Kevin Kline. He just does not work as Maurice. As we go along this episode, you're going to realize that that was a big part of this to me, was that it felt like so many of the actors in this movie just did not fit the part. And Kevin Kline is one of those. He doesn't have the quirkiness or the goofiness or kind of the dim-wittedness you had with Maurice in the original. Like, Maurice is like this great inventor, but he has like no common sense whatsoever, and you don't really get that with Kevin Kline in this. Kevin Kline is more of like a warm, fatherly figure for Belle, and he's clearly like down because of like this whole backstory that they get into that they absolutely did not need to get into. I like him, and he does a good job with what he's given, but I just don't feel like it fits the vibe that we're used to with Maurice, which was the quirky, kind of dim-witted, stupid but lovable dad that we had in the first one. As seems to be the case with so many of these movies, and really movies in general nowadays, there is a heavy usage on CGI, but it just falls so short. I don't mean a little short, I mean like the CGI in this movie is lackluster. For a movie that is not quite 3 years old yet, I mean, I feel like I could take a lot of PC games from around this same time, and you're gonna see better CGI than you see in a lot of the animals and a lot of the characters in this movie. And that's the problem, is they're trying to animate these movies using CGI, but the CGI just doesn't work because you have so much real stuff to put it up against that you really see how short the CGI falls. And the animators did a great job. The problem is it's just too heavily relied on. I mean, for the environments it works, but for characters, which they're all animated, it just, I don't know. 2017 is so recent that it shouldn't be as meh as it is. And the problem is that the CGI in this, they're trying to use animation to make it look as realistic as possible, and it just doesn't work that way because CGI in general just isn't there yet. It's amazing, the things they do with CGI now are incredible, but it's not enough to not make the quality of it stand out when it doesn't work with everything that's around it. Now, skipping ahead to when Maurice finally comes to the palace after the whole force scene and everything, the thing that stood out to me the most is that in the original one, Maurice is just looking for a quiet, warm place to warm up before he has to figure out what he's going to do next. Not in this one. In this one, he straight up goes right into where all the food is. He goes and warms himself up by the fire, and then he starts eating the dinner that's clearly on the table for somebody else. Yeah, of course he throws you in jail. Of course he throws you in the dungeon. Not only are you coming into his house uninvited, you're now eating his food. At least in the original one, it was like, okay, he's running away from these wolves. He's got to get inside. It's safety. You kind of feel bad for him for getting thrown away for that. In this one, he just goes and starts eating dude's food. And it's a big meal, and he's just munching into it like the prince or whoever he thinks is there is going to come and just be okay with it. Nope, I'm going to throw you in jail too. You broke in and you ate the food? No. I will say the thing that bothered me the most about everyone in the palace that's animated, why not get any of the original voice actors? Even go get Angela Lansbury for Mrs. Potts. She's not doing anything. There is not one original voice actor. Beauty and the Beast is from the 90s. This isn't like it's a movie made back in the 50s that we can't get anybody for. The original voice actors, if not all of them, some of them are still alive. I don't understand, if you're going to animate it again, why not bring in some of the original voice actors? It makes no sense to me whatsoever. If you're going to remake these movies and you want to keep the same vibe, or at least make the attempt at making the same vibe, why not bring in the original voice actors? They did so well in the original one. It makes no sense to me. And I understand you want to bring in new actors that people are familiar with. That's fine. Mix it up. Bring in new actors and bring in some of the original actors. Mix it up. But no, in this one, we're left with a bunch of actors that are good actors in their own rights, whose voices lend little to nothing to the personalities of the characters that we fell in love with. I love Ewan McGregor. Sir Ian McKellen, I love Sir Ian McKellen. Are you kidding me? Gandalf and Magneto? Not as Cogsworth. He doesn't work as Cogsworth at all. First of all, Cogsworth wasn't an old man in the original one, so it just hits the ear wrong already. And Ewan McGregor's French accent is not that good. And speaking of all of those characters, what happened with the animation? What is this insistence on making it look as realistic as possible? I understand you're calling these live action remakes. They totally are. They're animated and live action. You're calling them live action remakes, but you're animating these characters again already. You're already animating them again. Why not animate them in the same style? At least similarly. They did do a good job of sticking to the vibe of the original, but it only goes so far as to how the movie plays out. There's so many nuances, so many other things in this movie that just don't fit. I'm also not in the production meetings. I'm also not there for when they're making these. So I don't really know why they're doing it, but I do know that they're doing it and it's not working. The character designs for the characters in the palace, Lumiere, Cogsworth, Mrs. Potts, Chip, all of those people are terrible. Chip and Mrs. Potts, they just look bad. It just looks bad. Like, especially with Chip, it looks like they didn't even try. If you're taking an animated character and you're animating them again, why change it so dramatically? There's none of that liveliness. And I understand, like, it's supposed to be a sad, dreary palace where bad things are happening. Guess what? They accomplished that just fine in the original by giving you areas that were dark and then giving areas that were animated and that were lively, and this does not. And again, my biggest issue comes with the fact that you're animating them already. Why change it so drastically? If you're going to stick to the original movie so much, why change that? The set designs fit the original so well. The costume designs fit the vibe of the original so well, and yet here is where you decided to make these giant changes, and it stuck out the most. Of anything else, that's what stuck out the most to me, is that the characters we fell in love with look nothing, act like nothing, and seem like nothing like the originals do. They just don't. Speaking of animation, the Beast's CGI, the CGI for the Beast, and don't get me wrong, Dan Stevens as the Beast was very good, but the CGI for the Beast is again terrible. I think the Beast of anyone has the worst animation. Sometimes he feels bigger than he is. Sometimes he feels more human sized. It's just not good. The detail in there. And if it's going to be such a big character, a titular character, that seems like the one you should have spent the most time on, right? So much of this seems like change for the sake of change. And again, another great example of that is the song in the beer hall, Gaston's song. Now again, Luke Evans does a great job as Gaston. I think he just absolutely nailed Gaston in this movie. But the whole song in the beer hall is another one of those where it starts out feeling much like the original, and then it just goes off the rails so quickly. It just goes right off the rails, and I don't know why. It turns into this whole like production number that looks like it belongs more in like Chicago than it does in Beauty and the Beast. Changing that song added nothing to the story. It adds nothing to the story, and so much of the changes that they make in these movies doesn't do anything for the story. It's not there to change the story. It's not there to update anything. It's just there because they wanted to. Be Our Guest is another great example of changes that didn't need to be made. Now, I will say Be Our Guest actually does a pretty decent job of still being good, but we still fall back on the problem where everybody feels like just there's no soul and substance to their voices. It just sounds like they're singing the songs just to get through the song. It didn't draw me in the way the original did. The original ones felt like professionally done. It felt like there was a lot of focus and a lot of importance put on the music because, again, it's the staple of Disney. It's why music was in so many and why it took up so much in these classic movies. To go in and change the music is almost like changing the story itself. It felt like the music was an afterthought, is really what it felt like. And it feels like they put so much emphasis onto what pops and draws you in visually that the substance of these stories that makes them good stories is just kind of pushed off to the side as an afterthought. Another big thing that stood out was the whole when she gets the library, when Beast gives her the library, that giant library that she wanted so much. And that might actually be why the library in the village is so small as contrast to the one at the palace. But there was a contrast in the original one and the library was much bigger there too, so what do I know? But Beast basically just gives her the library in passing. Just like, well, if you like it, you can have it. Whereas in the original movie, he brings her to the library already knowing he wants to give it to her. Throughout this whole movie, until they're actually like blatantly in love. It doesn't feel like there's a buildup in the relationship. And I don't know if that was because they were trying to get around the Stockholm Syndrome thing, which you absolutely can't get around. There's no getting around the Stockholm Syndrome thing because it's the basis of the movie. She has to be held prisoner. It's the only way she gets kept at the palace. And she has to fall in love with him. There's no that is the two parts that equal Stockholm Syndrome in this story. And there's just no getting around that. I think as a byproduct of them trying to get around that, it doesn't really feel like there's a buildup in the relationship. But so, and that was such a big part to me because books are her escape from the village. And to undercut the impact of her receiving it, I mean, she's clearly joyful, but the gesture itself feels very empty in passing and not very relevant. It's more just like, they go to the library, she shows interest, and he goes, oh, you can have it if you want it. It's a big part of this movie and another example of trying to fix something that wasn't broke. The whole Paris of my childhood scene where he shows her the magic book that takes her back, and it gives this backstory into her and her dad and what happened to her mom, completely utterly useless. It just was pointless and did not need to be there at all. It doesn't make any difference whatsoever, and it adds to the running time of this movie, which again comes in over 2 hours. It's not like 2 hours for a movie is too long. It's one of those, you sit there, you watch it, and you realize this is way too long. And you start losing interest. It's more music you didn't need to throw in there. It's more scenes you didn't need to throw in there. It does nothing for this story whatsoever except deviate from the original a little bit because they wanted to. Yet again, change for the sake of change. It is the theme. I might as well just change the series name that we're doing to change for the sake of change because it really does feel like they're just adding stuff to add it when you don't need to add it. I know the Sanatorium. I like Sanatorium. We're gonna go with Sanatorium. It's probably wrong. I don't care. The Sanatorium director in the original is a very small character, like super small character. You get like one scene with him. I was a little sad to not see him in this. I know we have the coachman that has the padded carriage and everything to take him there. We're missing the scene completely with the director of the sanatorium, and that made me a little upset because, I mean, it didn't ruin anything. It didn't take anything away really because he was a small character, but I thought he was a really cool character. He was creepy, and he really kind of gave a lot of emphasis to how cruel the plan was, even though it's already clearly a cruel plan. It was just such a great character that it was sad to not see him in this one. I was disappointed, but that seems to be my general feeling on these movies so far anyway, is disappointment. When we get to Peter Pan, it'll be straight up depression. Right now it's just disappointment. I guess at least they kept the formal wear for Tale as Old as Time, which that scene was pretty well done. I enjoyed that. That was a well done scene. Again, another example of how you can stick to redoing these movies, add a little bit here without taking away in other parts. The outfits they have for Tale as Old as Time, spot on. Her dress is great. His whole outfit looks very much like the original, even though his entire body is very terribly CGI'd. And this, I feel like this scene is where we get a really good idea of the cinematography in this movie, because the cinematography is very good. The cinematography in all of these movies is very good. But that's more of a technicality from a filming standpoint. We're not reviewing these that way. However, it is worth mentioning that the cinematography in this movie is very good. And I think it's kind of, at least for me, it's kind of a saving grace. Not completely. It obviously didn't save these movies for me. Otherwise, I wouldn't have devoted an entire Angry series to these movies. And another scene that they did very well, I thought, was when the villagers all storm the palace and there's a huge battle at the palace. That was really well done. Yet another example of how they can really kind of update these scenes and update all these things without taking away. This was actually very well done. I found myself laughing. I found myself very into it. It was just, the whole thing was done really well. It actually kind of expanded on, made the battle scene a little bit bigger, gave you a bigger scope rather than just like Gaston versus the Beast, which they do a good job of kind of jumping back and forth. However, I'm not real sure why at the end when the little bridge and that little lookout area start crumbling, why they're crumbling. I don't know if it's due to the weight of Gaston and the Beast, even though it's clearly an area that's meant for foot traffic, or if they just needed a way to kill Gaston, which they really didn't. They could have just gone back to the original, whatever. I don't understand why it crumbles. It just seemed to be one of those things that, oh, it's just happening because reasons. In this one, everybody doesn't just automatically change back. Everybody actually turns into the furniture and appliances and things, as Cogsworth calls it, rubbish, that they are in form, except they finally just turn into those as inanimate objects. And that whole scene, I gotta say, is actually pretty heartbreaking. And that was a great example of them adding stuff that wasn't in there at all that actually impacted the story in a positive way. It really makes you feel for them because it's this huge loss. They tried so hard, they tried for so long, and they were almost there, and they didn't get it. Of course they do get it. They all end up coming back, and they all turn into themselves again as people. But again, even when we finally see all of these actors as their real life forms, it's for cameos. It really is for cameos. And the reason I think that's so important is for the thing that bothered me the most about this movie, which is you animated characters and you made them completely different. And you didn't have the original voice actors, none of them. It doesn't have to be all of them, but some of them. And the whole point of that is because I know voice actors are not on-camera actors. I know that some voice actors are terrible in front of a camera. But you can't tell me when it's a cameo for a few seconds or a minute or so that you couldn't just have some of these people come back. Even if they were terrible on screen, I could be an extra. Most of these people end up being extras. And you could have at least had some of them come back. My point is there wasn't really an excuse not to have any of the original voice actors, because those are the actors that really brought these characters to life. And these characters are brought to life in a kind of lackluster way. And that really could have been circumvented by just having a couple of the original voice actors that we fell in love with so much portray the characters that they brought to life so well. Overall, I know this movie and the movies we've done so far are getting great reviews. I know they got good reviews. I don't think they're being reviewed from a Disney fan standpoint, and that's really where these movies fall short for me. But as I said at the beginning of this episode, I did not hate Beauty and the Beast. It was definitely, of the three we've done so far, the truest to the original movie. And it did feel kind of like the first two were warm-ups, and the third one they're starting to get it together. I don't know if they got it together for the fourth. I don't know. I know the next one we'll be doing for episode 4 is going to be Dumbo, which, again, I'm highly skeptical of that one, because that is one of those ones that just is right here, and it's there deep with a lot of people. So, and if I'm not mistaken, it comes off kind of dark and weird, so we'll see how that goes. I don't have high hopes, but I didn't have high hopes for Beauty and the Beast, and it was actually, I was pleasantly surprised. So do stay tuned for episode 4, which will be Dumbo. That'll be coming next week. This episode came out a little bit late because I had some technical difficulties caused by operator error, and I'm the only one operating here, so you know whose fault that was. But with all of that said, I do hope you're staying well, healthy, and safe during the craziness that we're dealing with right now with the coronavirus. Please do like, subscribe, comment, leave movie suggestions. They don't have to be Disney movies. They just have to be movies that you think I might like to review. You might think I hate to review them. Those seem to be the most popular ones anyway. So leave those down in the comments. I'll see you guys next time.